Welcome back to Jack and Rex Tales. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, but Jack Thompson didn't open it until Thursday night. It sat on the kitchen counter of his small rented apartment in Clarksburg, leaning against the salt shaker like it had all the patience in the world. He walked past it a dozen times each day. He made coffee beside it. He ate his meals across from it. He knew what it was. He knew who it was from, or rather, who it was about. His grandmother's attorney, Hollow Creek, West Virginia, estate matters. He just wasn't ready. Rex knew something was wrong. The big German shepherd had barely left Jack's side since the letter arrived, following him from room to room with quiet, steady devotion. Not anxious, not demanding, just present, the way Rex always was when he sensed the weight shifting inside Jack's chest. On Thursday night, Jack finally sat down at the kitchen table, poured himself a glass of water he never drank, and opened the envelope. The words were simple and legal and cold, but one line stopped him completely. The property known as the Thompson House, located on Mercy Ridge, Hollow Creek, West Virginia, is hereby bequeathed in its entirety to Mr. Jack Allen Thompson. He read it 3 times. Then he set the paper down, pressed both hands flat on the table, and stared at the wall for a long time. Rex rested his chin on Jack's knee. Jack didn't say a word. He just reached down and laid his hand on the dog's broad head, and the two of them sat there in the quiet of that small apartment while the old clock on the wall counted seconds that felt heavier than usual. He hadn't been back to Hollow Creek in 11 years, and now his grandmother's house, the house everyone in town whispered about, the house sitting alone on that cold ridge above the valley like something out of a story meant to frighten children, that house was his. He closed his eyes. Somewhere in the back of his mind he could still hear her voice. "Jackie, when the time comes, you'll know what to do." He hadn't understood those words when she said them 3 years ago over the phone, her voice thinner than he remembered. He hadn't asked what she meant. He should have asked. He hadn't visited enough. That truth sat in his stomach like a stone. "All right, buddy," he said quietly, scratching Rex behind the ear. "Looks like we're going home." They drove into Hollow Creek on a gray November morning, Jack's truck loaded with 2 duffel bags, Rex's gear, and not much else. The Appalachian mountains rose around the valley like old men standing watch, patient, permanent, unbothered by the seasons changing below them. The town looked exactly as Jack remembered, and somehow smaller. The Creekside Diner still had the hand-painted sign above its door. The white church at the end of Main Street still had one crooked shutter that nobody had fixed in 30 years. The hardware store, the barber shop, the single traffic light that blinked yellow after 9 at night, all of it preserved like a photograph of something that refused to change. Jack parked in front of a small brick building with a sign that read, "Harlan Goss, Attorney at Law." He sat in the truck for a moment, watching a few people move along the sidewalk. An older woman in a red coat glanced at him and then looked away. A man outside the diner recognized him and gave a slow, uncertain nod. They knew who he was. They knew why he was here. Jack got out of the truck. Rex jumped down beside him and stood straight, ears forward, reading the town the way he'd once read foreign streets, carefully, without fear. "Come on," Jack said softly. The reading of the will was brief. The attorney's office smelled like old paper and wood polish. 3 cousins Jack barely knew sat in chairs along the wall, their expressions arranged into careful politeness that didn't quite hide their expectations. Harlan Goss, a thin man in his 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, read through the document methodically. Small items went to various relatives. A modest savings account was divided. A quilt that had hung in Eleanor's hallway for 40 years went to a cousin named Darlene, who received it with exaggerated gratitude. Then Harlan looked up over his glasses. To her grandson, Jack Allen Thompson, he read carefully. The property, known as the Thompson House on Mercy Ridge, including all contents therein. The room went quiet in a particular way, the kind of quiet that carries its own commentary. One of the cousins, a heavy-set man named Gerald who smelled like cigarettes and cologne, let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. "Well," Gerald said, not quite under his breath, "better him than me." Darlene pressed her lips together and studied the ceiling. Jack said nothing. He looked at Harlan, who met his eyes with something that felt like an apology. "There's also this," Harlan said, sliding a sealed envelope across the desk. Jack's name was written across the front in his grandmother's handwriting, that familiar slant, those careful letters, the same hand that had written him birthday cards every year he was overseas without missing a single one. Jack took the envelope and tucked it inside his jacket without opening it. He thanked Harlan. He nodded to the cousins. He walked outside into the cold November air where Rex was waiting beside the truck, and he stood on the sidewalk and looked up toward the ridge. The house was just barely visible through the tree line, a dark shape against the gray sky, stone walls rising above the oaks like something ancient and patient. Rex followed his gaze. The dog's ears rose slowly. His body went still in that particular way that meant he was reading something, feeling something that Jack couldn't quite name yet. "What do you think?" Jack asked him quietly. Rex looked at him, then back at the ridge. Jack pulled his collar up against the wind. "Yeah," he said, "me too." The road up Mercy Ridge was narrow and steep and shot through with tree roots that had pushed up through the asphalt over years of neglect. Jack drove slowly, the truck rocking gently, bare branches scraping the roof in the wind. When the house came into full view, he stopped the truck and simply looked at it. It was larger than memory had made it. 3 stories of dark stone, a wide front porch with solid oak pillars, tall windows framed in aged timber. It looked less like a family home and more like something built with intention, built to endure. The oak trees surrounding it were enormous, their bare branches spreading overhead like the arms of old guardians. The townspeople said it was cursed. They said lights appeared in the windows at night when no one was inside. They said strangers came and went from this house years ago, quietly, in the dark, and no one could explain why. Children dared each other to walk up the ridge road. Adults changed the subject when the house came up in conversation. Jack had grown up hearing the whispers. He'd never understood them. His grandmother had simply been a private woman, and people in small towns sometimes filled privacy with suspicion. He got out of the truck. Rex landed beside him and moved immediately toward the front porch, nose working, tail still, professional in a way that made Jack almost smile. The front door opened with the key Harlan had provided. It swung inward without a sound, the hinges recently oiled. Jack stepped inside and stopped. The house was not what he expected. It was not dark or rotting or cold. It was not a ruin wearing the costume of a home. The floors were clean hardwood, swept and solid. The furniture was old but well kept. A stone fireplace in the main room, shelves of books along every wall, a kitchen with a long oak table that could seat 10 people comfortably. Blankets were folded and stacked on a cedar chest near the stairs. The pantry, when Jack opened it, was stocked. Canned goods, dry goods, the kind of quiet preparation that spoke of someone who thought carefully about the future. The house smelled faintly like cedar and something else, something warm and familiar that Jack couldn't name for a moment. Then it came to him. His grandmother's kitchen. Sunday mornings. The particular smell of her house when she was cooking and the wood stove was burning and the windows fogged at the edges. He stood in the hallway and breathed it in and felt the back of his throat tighten in a way he hadn't expected. Rex pressed against his leg. "I'm all right," Jack said softly. He wasn't entirely sure that was true. On the living room table, exactly as the attorney had described, sat a single small envelope. Jack sat down in the chair beside the table. He took a long breath. Then he opened it. His grandmother's handwriting again, steady and careful, the way she did everything. "Jackie, if you're reading this, then you were brave enough to come up here. I always knew you would be. This house was never cursed. I let people think what they needed to think, because this house needed protecting, and fear is a reliable fence. Before you decide what to do with it, walk through every room, open every drawer, read what's on the shelves in the upstairs study. Then you'll understand why I left it to you and not to someone who only wanted what it was worth. I love you, Jackie. I always have. I'm sorry I didn't say it enough out loud. Gran." Jack read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully along its original crease and held it in both hands for a moment, the way you hold something you know you will keep for the rest of your life. Rex sat at his feet and watched him with those steady amber eyes, patient, present, asking nothing. "She knew," Jack said quietly, to no one in particular. "She always knew." He spent the rest of that day walking through every room, the way she'd asked. In the upstairs study, he found them, shelves lined not with novels or decoration, but with journals. Dozens of them, spanning decades, each one labeled by year in his grandmother's careful hand. He pulled the oldest one from the shelf and opened it to a random page. November 1987. The Harmon family came up tonight. Father lost his job at the mill. 3 children. Mother is unwell. They'll stay in the East rooms until spring. I told no one in town. They need time, not gossip. He pulled another. March 1994. Returned tonight from picking up the Waverly boy from the county line. 19 years old. Back from the Gulf. Nowhere to go and too proud to say so. Set him up in the upstairs room. He stayed 6 weeks. Didn't talk much at first. By the end, he was helping me repair the fence. He just needed somewhere quiet to remember who he was. Jack set the journal down and stood very still. He pulled another and another. Families who had lost their homes, women leaving difficult situations, veterans returning from wars Jack himself knew the weight of, children who needed somewhere safe while the adults in their lives sorted through crisis. Decade after decade after decade. His grandmother had run this house as a quiet refuge, hidden behind the town's own fear and gossip, protected by a reputation she had deliberately cultivated and never corrected. She hadn't been mysterious. She had been merciful. The house wasn't called Mercy Ridge because of the terrain. Jack understood that now. He sat down slowly in the old wooden chair at the study desk and looked around the room, at the decades of quiet record, the careful handwriting, the ordinary notebooks filled with extraordinary compassion, and he pressed one hand over his eyes and sat that way for a long time. Rex climbed the stairs and found him there. He walked across the room and leaned his full weight gently against Jack's leg, that particular pressure that said, "I'm here. You're not alone. Take your time." Jack lowered his hand and looked at his dog. "She did all of this," he said quietly. "All these years. And nobody knew." Rex held his gaze. Jack nodded slowly, the way a man nods when something settles into place inside him. Not easily, not without weight, but permanently. The storm came 8 days later. It arrived faster than the forecast predicted, the way Appalachian winters sometimes do, dropping out of the north overnight with a ferocity that caught the valley unprepared. By morning, power lines were down across 3 streets. The temperature had fallen to 6 degrees. Roads were buried under 14 inches of snow and still climbing. Jack stood at the mansion's front window and watched Hollow Creek go dark house by house as the grid failed. The generator in the basement hummed steadily. Eleanor had maintained it meticulously. The house was warm, dry, stocked with everything it needed. He didn't hesitate. He put on his heaviest coat, laced his boots, and looked at Rex. "Let's go," he said. They went down the ridge road into town in the gray early morning, Jack moving through the snow with the same quiet determination that had carried him through harder circumstances than a winter storm, Rex working beside him with focused, steady energy. He started with the elderly residents he'd identified during his first days back in town. Margaret Elise, 81 years old, widow, living alone on Sycamore Street, her oil heater no match for 6 degrees. He knocked on her door, and she opened it in a heavy coat and 2 sweaters, her breath visible in the cold air inside her own home. "Jack Thompson," she said, with a voice full of surprise and something else, relief she hadn't known she was holding. "Mrs. Elise," he said, "I've got a warm house up on the ridge. Will you come?" She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Rex, who sat in the snow beside Jack, looking up at her with calm, patient eyes. "That dog won't bother my nerves?" she asked. "He'll be the best company you've had in years," Jack said. She almost smiled. "Give me 5 minutes." He moved through the town methodically, the way he'd once moved through objectives, except this mission was warmth and safety, and the particular relief of not leaving anyone behind. A family with 3 young children on Birch Road, an elderly man named Howard who'd been a Korean War veteran and accepted help only after Jack said simply, "Sir, I need assistance transporting people up the ridge. Would you be willing to help me?" Giving the old man a role rather than a rescue, which was the only way Howard would accept it. One by one, then in small groups, Jack and Rex guided people up Mercy Ridge. Inside the mansion, the stone fireplace burned. The long kitchen table seated people who had never been inside this house before, who had driven past it their whole lives with a shiver of unease, who were now wrapping their hands around mugs of hot soup and looking around at the warm rooms with expressions of quiet astonishment. The children found Rex within the first 10 minutes. He let them come to him on their own terms, lying down in front of the fire, enormous and warm and perfectly still, while small hands buried themselves in his thick fur. A little girl of about 5 fell asleep against his side, her fingers curled in his coat, and Rex didn't move for 2 hours. Jack watched this from the kitchen doorway. He thought about that journal entry. He just needed somewhere quiet to remember who he was. He thought about his grandmother, the woman he hadn't visited enough, hadn't called enough, hadn't told enough times what she meant to him. He thought about how she had looked at him the last time he'd seen her in person, 7 years ago, at Christmas, before he'd let distance and silence grow between them the way it sometimes does, slowly, without intention, until suddenly there are years between you and the person you love most. He pressed the back of his hand briefly against his mouth and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he straightened and went back to the kitchen to make more soup. The storm broke on the 3rd day. People returned to their homes slowly, stepping out into a town covered in clean white snow and brittle, brilliant sunlight. They thanked Jack with handshakes and quiet words and eyes that held something that hadn't been there before. Not the wariness, not the whispers, something closer to recognition. Gerald, his cousin, the man who had laughed under his breath in the attorney's office, came up the ridge road on the 4th day. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and looked at Jack for a long moment. "I owe you an apology," Gerald said finally, "and I owed your grandmother one a long time before that." Jack looked at him steadily. "She wouldn't have wanted an apology, Gerald." "What would she have wanted?" Jack thought about it. "For people to stop being afraid of what they don't understand," he said, "and to help their neighbors when they need it." Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, slowly, the way a man nods when something costs him something to admit. "You need any help up here?" he asked. "I need someone who knows this town," Jack said, and someone who can fix a fence. Gerald almost smiled. I can do both. That evening, after the house had emptied and gone quiet, Jack climbed the stairs to his grandmother's study. He sat at the old wooden desk. He ran his hand along the shelf of journals, all those years, all those quiet acts, all those lives steadied by one woman's stubborn, private mercy. He reached into the bottom drawer and found a fresh notebook, exactly as he knew he would. She left it there for him. He opened it to the first page. He picked up the pen. November, Mercy Ridge. Gran, I understand now. I'm sorry it took me so long to come back. I should have visited more. I should have told you more. I'm going to spend the rest of the time I have making sure this place keeps doing what you built it to do. Nobody faces the storm alone. Not here. I promise. He set the pen down. Rex lay beside the desk, his head resting on his front paws, watching Jack with those steady amber eyes. Outside, the Appalachian night was cold and clear and full of stars, and the valley below Mercy Ridge lay quiet under its coat of snow. Jack sat in the warm study of his grandmother's house, his house now, and for the first time since leaving the army, since leaving the structure and mission and brotherhood that had defined 20 years of his life, he felt something settle inside his chest like a coal catching hold. Not happiness, exactly. Something older and quieter than happiness. Purpose. The kind that asks nothing of you except that you show up. The kind his grandmother had lived by her entire life. He reached down and rested his hand on Rex's head. Rex closed his eyes. The house was warm. The pen waited. And Jack Thompson, 50 years old, retired soldier, grandson of Eleanor Thompson of Mercy Ridge, finally, truly came home. Some houses are built to impress. Some are built to last. And some, a rare few, are built for the moments when the storm arrives and someone needs to know there's a door they can knock on. Eleanor Thompson spent her life being that door, quietly, without recognition, without needing anyone to know. She left that legacy to the one person she trusted to carry it forward. Not because he was the strongest, but because she knew that beneath the silence a war had left in him, her grandson still understood the most important thing a person can know. That showing up for someone who is suffering is not a burden. It is the whole point. If this story reminded you of someone you loved, a grandmother, a neighbor, a veteran who never talked about what they carried, then carry them with you today. Honor them the way Eleanor would have wanted, quietly, without needing credit. And if you believe that loyalty and mercy and showing up for your neighbors still matter in this world, subscribe to Jack and Rex Tales. Every story we tell is a reminder that the best of America lives not in the loudest voices, but in the quiet ones, the ones who simply open their door when the storm comes. We'll see you in the next story.